black sky.
Greetings. My name is Dmytro Antoniuk. I am from Kiev, Ukraine, and I am part of Black Sky team. And this is our weekly digest of our materials that we've done for the past week. We will start with the article done by Artur, and it's about the recent summit in Ankara, in Turkey. It's called NATO in Ankara redefines its defense strategy in response to the long-term threat from Moscow. This article examines the outcomes of the 2026 NATO summit in Ankara, where allies reaffirmed their commitment to collective defense under Article 5, identified Russia as a long term threat, and outlined plans for continued military support to Ukraine. It argues that the summit's most significant outcome is a new burden sharing model with Europe and Canada expected to finance and produce more defense capabilities while the US retains its technological and political leadership. The analysis also clarifies that the widely reported 70 billion for Ukraine is not a single native fund, but the combined value of national commitments. It notes that despite Donald Trump's more positive rhetoric towards Volodymyr Zelensky and discussions on Patriot missile production, no major shift in US military policy or immediate increase in aid has been officially announced. Finally, Arthur highlights that NATO's growing focus on defense industrial cooperation, particularly in drone technologies, and concludes that while the Ankara summit strengthened long term planning and support for Ukraine, its success will ultimately depend on whether political commitments are translated into concrete contracts, production, and military deliveries. So that's it for the article about summit of NATO in Ankara. And the next article is done again by my colleague Artur, and it's about Russian drones. It's called the Alabuga military production line: drones, teenagers, and digital recruitment. This piece looks at how the Alabuga special economic zone in Tatarstan in Russia, once created to attract business and investment, has become one of Russia's main centers for producing Geraim 2 drones based on Iranian designs. It explains how military production has expanded while being presented as part of a civilian, industrial, and education project. A key part of this analysis focuses on the people working there, using information from U.S. sanctions, AP investigations, and other sources. This article describes the reported involvement of underage students from Alabuga Polytech and the recruitment of young women from Africa through the Alabuga Start program with promises of education and well paid jobs. Arthur also notes that the UN has said these practices could be considered human trafficking if deception and exploitation are proven. The piece also shows how social media was used to attract workers through YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok before many of the accounts were removed. Overall, Arthur argues that Alabuga is more than a drone factory. It is an example of how Russia combines military production, education, online recruitment, and labor practices to support its war against Ukraine. The next one is written by Olha Semashko, and it's called Geography Did Not Save It. Ukraine attacked Russia's largest oil refinery, which we see almost every night. This article examines Ukraine's drone strike on the Omsk oil refinery, Russia's largest refinery, located more than 2,500 kilometers from Ukrainian border. It argues that the attack shows that even Russia's most distant strategic infrastructure is no longer beyond the reach of Ukrainian long range drones. Uh, Olga explains the importance of the Omsk refinery, which produces a significant share of Russia's petrol, diesel, and aviation fuel. Even a partial shutdown could deepen the country's fuel shortages, increase pressure on supplies, and push petrol prices even higher. The article also suggests that the Angarsk refinery may become the next likely target if Ukraine continues its campaign against Russia's oil industry. Overall, Olga argues that these long range strikes are changing the balance of the war by putting greater pressure on Russia's energy sector. It concludes that geography is no longer enough to protect key infrastructure, while growing fuel shortages and rising prices highlight the wider economic impact of Ukraine's drone campaign. The next material is also written by Olga Semashko. Uh, it is Oil Superpower Begins Importing Petrol. This material explores how Russia has become a net importer of petrol from the first time in many years after Ukrainian strikes substantially reduced the country's oil refining capacity. It explains that Russia is now purchasing fuel from Belarus and has also secured supply agreements with Kazakhstan and India to help relieve growing shortages. Um, Olga argues that imports alone are not enough to solve the problem. Fuel production has dropped sharply, while demand remains high during the summer months. Although Russian officials describe the shortages as local and temporary, restrictions on fuel sales have already been introduced across most regions, with reports of queues, purchase limits, and growing pressure on transport and agriculture. Overall, this material suggests that Ukraine's attacks on Russia's energy infrastructure are having a wider economic impact. Rising fuel prices, increasing imports, and supply problems across Russia are neighboring countries show how the campaign is putting sustained pressure on the Russian economy. And the last one for today is again by Olga Semashka. Russia has returned to the IOC, but not to the world of sports. This piece looks at the International Olympic Committee's decision to reinstate the Russian Olympic Committee after it removed sports councils from occupied Ukrainian territories from its charter. Although the IOC has recommended easing restrictions on Russian athletes, the final decisions on participation and the use of national symbols remain in the hands of international sports federations. Olga points out that many federations and host countries are still reluctant to welcome Russian athletes, while some sports now allow them to compete under a neutral status. Others continue to enforce bans. Several countries have also refused to issue visas to Russian athletes or permit the display of the Russian flag and anthem at international events. This piece concludes that Russia's return to the IOC does not mean a full return to international sport, with federations and host nations continuing to set their own rules. Russian athletes are still likely to face significant restrictions at major competitions. Well, that's it for this week's digest. My name is Dmytro Antoniuk. Please stay tuned at our website blacksky.info. Feel free to look at it at any time and see you later. Bye bye.